Often women abandon themselves to focus on helping others. What happens is when you abandon yourself, you abandon your authenticity. Hi, this is Jim Brown. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a licensed professional clinical counselor in Orange County, California. What I'm going to be talking about today is self-abandonment, or what we think of as abandonment of the self. Seems like kind of a strange term to some people. If this is something you've been experiencing in your own life, you might automatically resonate with what that means. Abandonment of the self is what happens when we start to abandon our own authentic needs, desires, values, and boundaries in service of other people, in service of meeting other people's expectations. And often this is a result of trying to protect ourselves. We end up betraying ourselves and letting ourselves down because we neglect the true self and focus solely on other people's needs and demands. Now, as people, we need to be responsive to each other and be cooperative with each other and be there for people when they need us, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is something that generally has its origins in our early family of origin issues. This is something that starts to happen in families where there might be a narcissistic parent or a parent with mental illness or borderline personality features, or an emotionally immature parent. And often it happens when parents or caregivers are dismissive or invalidating. And what can happen is, as a child is growing, is maturing, you start to lose your true self. You start to lose connection to what your true self is, and you might start to develop a false self or a role self. A role self is kind of a curated version of ourselves that we learn to identify how, when, if we can actually ask to have our needs met, and we learn ways to keep ourselves from getting hurt. And often when we're trapped in this dynamic and we abandon ourselves, we experience conflicts of needs, because as humans we want to be known, we want to be seen, yet it can also be terrifying to reveal your true self to some people because you might be punished for that. And what happens is the self starts to become fragmented. Now, there are ways to heal from this, to recover from this abandonment of self, and yet for some people, even in adulthood, there remain real safety issues. There may be still threats, real threats. You may be in a relationship with somebody who is abusive or dangerous to be with, and it may continue to be not safe to be authentic. Many elements of society feel risks at being too authentic or being too much themselves. Unfortunately, as much as progress has been made in many ways, many LGBT people are not safe to be truly authentic sometimes. Racial minorities, especially in different parts of our country, still can't be their authentic selves all the time. And often women in a patriarchal society, they can't often be fully authentic in their expression. Often women abandon themselves to focus on helping others. Men also abandon themselves, particularly by abandoning their vulnerability and their emotions. And when this fragmentation of the self happens, a lot of times what we experience is something called a repetition compulsion. In other words, we find ways to unconsciously recreate those situations in adulthood, or maybe we enter relationships with people who will recreate those dynamics. So the cost of abandoning oneself can be very high. What happens is when you abandon yourself, you abandon your authenticity. You end up not actually getting what it is that you want, what you need. And often what happens is we swap authenticity for safety. We might somehow learn that our worth is based on serving a function for other people. We often neglect our own self-care. We might start losing sleep, maybe not eating well, not taking care of our daily needs. And we can lose the ability to validate ourselves and our own emotions, and often seek external validation. And long term, this damages our self-esteem, it damages our self-worth and our concept of ourself. Now, these patterns often originate because they're serving a practical purpose. They're keeping us safe, and in some ways you could even think that this is sort of a creative way that our mind does this. But then eventually we generally find out that those patterns don't serve us any longer. And that's when we want to start looking at ways to recover from this. What that means is finding other ways of being that aren't so costly to us, and finding different ways of asking to have our needs met, and rewriting some of those old scripts. Some signs that you might be experiencing abandonment of the self are if you find that you are a people pleaser, if you end up taking on way too much for other people, doing things for other people that they could do, or focusing so much on serving their needs that you start to feel depleted, in which case you might need to learn how to set limits and have different types of boundaries. If you find yourself seeking external validation, needing the approval of other people, and developing self-esteem that's based on what other people think of you. In other words, I'm okay if you think I'm okay, in which case you might need to learn some self-compassion and some self-love. Another sign of abandoning yourself is avoiding emotions. When we learn how to either just go along to get along, and we do that a lot, or we end up numbing our own emotions, or trying to avoid our own experience, trying to repress emotions. And also, if you find that you don't respect yourself and you can't set limits with people, and you don't have good interpersonal psychological boundaries. So what does recovery look like? Ultimately, the self, the true self, needs to be grown, needs to be matured. Sometimes it needs to be remembered and reintegrated into our life. Healing means growing to feel safer and learning to take risks and not continuing to avoid all the time. We need to tell ourselves that, other people do this, other people ask for what they need, so it must be okay for me to do that because they're human and I'm human. Of course, we always have to take into consideration all of those real life threats, but also have to determine what's the difference between a real life threat and maybe something that is happening in my mind and my body as a result of trauma. And this brings up the whole idea of doing therapy and working with a therapist who understands these processes, and maybe even a therapist who works specifically healing trauma. Learning to observe other people and have this true self modeled for us, in other words, to see how other people do it, can help us to move towards doing that for ourselves. And telling yourself that I matter as much as anyone else. Because often what happens is we get stuck into a dynamic of fearing expressing ourselves, and then there's a fear of what might happen if I do that. How am I going to be hurt, punished, discarded if I do that? And then we learn ways to inhibit the expression of our true self. In our healing process, often people go through feelings of shame that I allowed that to happen, or I let it go on for so long, or that I could let people take advantage of me in that way. And when feelings of shame come up like this, these are very intense emotions that also bring up grief. We do have to grieve the losses. Often we have to grieve the loss of the authentic life and expression that I could have had. Sometimes we end up grieving the loss of the family that I thought that I lived with, who were actually very different people. If we can turn the shame into grieving, then it becomes a much more productive process rather than beating up on ourselves and internalizing that shame. One way to kind of conceptualize or think about this dynamic is we internalize views, values, narratives of other people. We internalize their opinions about us, and all of that, others and the world around us becomes like a huge thing, sort of like a planet, and our true self becomes a smaller moon that sort of orbits around all of that other stuff about other people. And the true self, it never makes true contact. So really, this healing process involves growing greater autonomy of the self and shifting that balance so that opinions of other people has less impact on you, and your own authenticity has greater impact on you. So we start to shift the polarity, so to speak, and grow the true self. That means that we need to learn to release the need to justify ourselves to other people and develop healthier versions of self-esteem that's not solely based on what other people think about us. Ultimately, what we're talking about is the process of differentiation, which is a lifelong process for many of us. We can still love people, we can still feel connected to people, but we can get to the point that your thoughts about me don't make me. They don't make my reality. We lose ourself, we abandon ourself when safety becomes the priority over authenticity. And when we can start to shift that to making authenticity a main priority for us, then we know that we're on the pathway. Often, when we're young, this dynamic happens because we need to protect some attachment relationship, because I need this person in order to survive or be safe. And we develop an adapted self that might have served you then, but not so much now. The risk of authenticity can be very high when you're in a situation where you have to hide parts of yourself. But now that you're more grown up and you have better coping mechanisms, or hopefully you can develop better coping skills, and that might even be part of the therapy process. When you're no longer trapped in the same way and you develop more and more resources, you can see a way out of that dilemma. Often, one way of helping yourself move out of that self-abandonment is actually calling upon the different parts of yourself that do encourage authentic expression, and even the parts of you that are righteously angry and kind of fed up and sick of tired of being bullied and being inauthentic, of abandoning yourself, of your dignity, of your integrity, and calling upon that righteous anger that's inside of you and learning how to channel it into productive movement forward. Fitting in is not the same as belonging. When you have to change yourself in order to belong, that's not belonging, that's fitting in. Belonging is when we're embraced and accepted for who we are, not for what we can change ourselves to be in some more acceptable way. I'd like to hear what people think about this topic, maybe what your experience of it has been, and I encourage you to start a conversation, leave some comments, and let me know what you think, maybe what you'd like to hear about also. And if the videos are helpful, I encourage you to like and subscribe, sign up for notifications, and until the next time, take care of yourself and take care of one another.